Deputy Madam Speaker. This Labor-Palaszczuk government can't even manage train timetables. So how can we trust them to manage something far more complex, which is the transition of hardened 17-year-old criminals into the youth justice system? There are things that on the surface may look attractive, but when you start to look at the detail, you realise you need a good plan, you need to know what you're doing, and there shouldn't be a naivety about that process. My real concern has been outlined by a number of my colleagues previously who've raised the concern that there is no plan to effectively make this transition and have the outcomes that we all want to see, which are fewer people committing crimes, which are fewer people being subject to crime themselves. Clearly there are valid concerns about the lack of detail around Labor's plan, because this legislation isn't accompanied by a plan. It's a headline with a power to transition 17-year-old criminals into the youth detention system, but no detail as to how that's going to be done. And that's where the real concern is. How can you trust this Labor government when they have a litany of failed administration, which has had serious concerns? We've seen it with the health payroll system, with the devastation with the health professionals. We've seen it in a number of our other areas of administration. And it's time that there was recognition that the impacts of failed administration and shonky government are significant in their impact on people's everyday lives. So when there are good intentions...
Member for Maroochydore.
Deputy Speaker, I rise on a point of order and I refer to Standing Order 236. This member from Maroochydore is totally off track on this bill and is completely irrelevant on the Youth Justice Bill before this chamber. I ask that you bring it back to relevance.
I'm listening very carefully to the contribution of the member for Maroochydore, and I would just remind her of the long title of the bill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'll remind the member who took offence to the fact that this government has a failed administration in regard to serious and complex issue, and they ignore that failed administration. It's entirely relevant to this issue before the House, because the criticism that we have in opposition of this Labor government is that they cannot manage a chook raffle, let alone complex and difficult issues such as this. I believe that there are people of good intent who do want to see 17-year-olds removed from adult prisons for very laudable reasons. The concerns we've raised is that any such transition has to be accompanied with an appropriate plan and consideration so that there are not unintended consequences. But what we haven't seen is that plan. So I can see the squawking of the member who took offence to the fact that I've raised this litany of failed administration of Labor governments in this state, and this government in particular. But we have to raise it here, because it's not enough to have good intentions. You've got to have good actions. You've got to understand your plans and how you administer them. That matters, because otherwise you damage people more than they are damaged already by the circumstances we see through lives of crime. As my colleague, the member for Everton, outlined, that unfortunately not all those who are of the age of 17 are of the same ilk of crime that they've committed, and that we see there are those who are in fact offenders who've committed such grievous crimes such as murdering people. There are others who have other ranks of crime which, while necessitating being brought into the criminal justice system, aren't of the same gravity. And they can't be treated the same way. There must be a realistic way of addressing the issue of how these 17-year-olds are dealt with in the criminal justice system. This soft on crime Labor government has simply scrapped the LNP government's 2014 youth justice reforms without even putting something else more effective in their place. Once again, they say that they're going to make things better, but they've not in fact administered and brought about that very action that they claim they wanted to do. They simply are about headlines rather than about substance. The last 12 months they've not introduced any new policies or reforms in regard to effectively combating juvenile crime. One of the issues that my colleagues have raised, and I'll raise here as well, is the need to address certainly early intervention, certainly prevention. And one of the most effective ways to address that range of crimes that people see reflected through the youth detention system and in the adult criminal justice system, one of the most cost-effective ways is early intervention. It is always a lot more expensive to deal with people who are hardened in their criminal ways and have had years of criminal activity, whether as juveniles or whether as adults. So early intervention, and that was the focus certainly of the LNP's plan with some of the youth justice initiatives that we had. This Labor government's been critical of those, but once again they've failed to deliver something that's better than that. The issue of recidivism and breaking the cycle of recidivism is an extremely significant one. As my colleague, the member for Everton, also mentioned, there's been an ad hoc way of approaching a lot of these issues where really it's time that there is a root and branch full understanding of the cycle of crime so that we see a real breakthrough in the way that we address recidivism. I will say also that there is an issue around transitions when people are in, be they detention or adult jails, the issue of post-jail reform as well as in-jail reform, and that this whole issue has not yet been appropriately addressed. It's very much an ad hoc approach that we see from this Labor government here. Now they've come up with a proposal to transfer 17-year-old offenders from adult criminal justice system into the youth justice system without any tangible plan on how to deal with the practicalities of this change, and particularly in respect to how to keep younger children safe and separate from these older 17-year-old criminals. They've talked about it in theory, but there's no detail about how they're going to do that. From evidence provided to the committee, the government has no plan on how to manage the delicate process of transitioning these 17-year-olds in youth detention, into youth detention facilities alongside much younger children. How can the government guarantee the safety of very young detainees, some as young as 10, if 17-year-olds who may have committed serious offences are moved into the juvenile justice system? Now, I've heard people say, oh, they're all going to be separate and that's the practice, but once again, I don't have that confidence that this government has the ability or the understanding of how to achieve that. There has to be not only a change in the number of people working in this system, you actually physically have to build significant new facilities to do that. Furthermore, this asleep-at-the-wheel Labor government doesn't even have a clear picture of how much this plan would cost. They don't know what their plan is, they don't know really what it's going to cost. There's been an estimate that it could be about $44 million per annum. Now that's a pretty significant additional amount of money, but there have been forecasts that in fact that's far greater than that because of that physical rebuild that has to take place. Now I know it's uncomfortable for many people opposite for us to ask these questions, but it is reasonable to ask the questions. It's not enough to have good intentions. It's not enough to tick that little box and say we've satisfied our need to be seen to be doing the right thing and then not have a plan to actually achieve that. Because outcomes matter. Not just what you say you're going to do, outcomes matter. But guess what? They did forget to include the cost of additional staffing requirements over that $44 million per annum guesstimate. And that's something that we have a very valid concern about. A recent question on notice revealed that as at the 1st of September 2016, there were 14 17-year-olds in youth detention and 49 17-year-olds in adult prisons. I think it's important to note that 17-year-olds in adult prisons are accommodated together with other 17-year-olds away from the rest of the adult prison population. This means that the government is planning to spend $44 million at least, because we know in fact it's most likely going to be a lot more than that, than with all the capital build, that they're going to spend at least $44 million to bring less than 50 17-year-olds from adult prisons into youth detention centres. I'll say that again. This Labor government is planning to spend at least $44 million to bring less than 50 17-year-olds from adult prisons into youth detention centres. And Labor's plan also indicates the possible need for a new $400 million youth detention centre. We need more than good intentions, we need good actions. We need an overhaul in the way that recidivism, early prevention and intervention occurs, not only with youth but in older age brackets. And I would have welcomed a plan that sincerely addressed that. This legislation doesn't. Unfortunately, it's a damaging con because it doesn't provide the answers in a concrete way that will achieve
The member's time has expired. I call the member for Sunnybank.